if you think about it, 83-year-old man versus $400 million company, even though the $400 million company's in the wrong, they're gonna win, you know? I wish we could just send him an email, like show up to court this day. That would be so easy for us, but this is how the law works. Like, that's not my fault. Like, I don't make the law. If I made the law, send him an email, and they're like, he doesn't want your papers, you just have to figure it out civilly. And I'm like, this is the civil method, you know? Like, to do it civilly, you have to serve. They're like, well, then just sue him then. And I'm like, that's what we're doing. Like, you see how this is a circle?
For years, YouTuber Reckless Ben built a reputation around pushing boundaries, investigating controversial organizations, and taking viewers deep inside stories that many people never expected to see. His content often blurred the line between internet entertainment and investigative journalism, attracting a loyal audience that followed every new project. But in recent months, that reputation collided with something far more serious. What began as an online investigation would eventually lead to police involvement, legal questions, public controversy, and not one, but two separate arrests. Supporters claim the situation raises troubling questions about accountability, transparency, and how far content creators can go when investigating a story. Critics argue that certain actions may have crossed legal boundaries, regardless of the intentions behind them. As details emerged, the story became increasingly complicated. Social media exploded with speculation. Viewers searched through videos looking for clues. Legal observers began examining public records. And with every new development, more questions appeared than answers. What exactly happened? How did an internet investigation become a criminal matter? What role did Lego play in the controversy that captured attention across YouTube? And perhaps most importantly, what do court records, public statements, and the available evidence actually show? The answers are not as straightforward as many people initially believed, because buried inside this story are disputed claims, conflicting narratives, unanswered questions, and a timeline that becomes more complicated the closer you examine it. And before the story was over, authorities would take action not once, but twice. To understand how everything reached that point, we have to go back to where the controversy first began. The story started with a collection that allegedly disappeared. Not a few Lego sets, not a handful of rare pieces. According to public claims surrounding the dispute, the collection involved hundreds of sets and rare minifigures, with an estimated value reaching into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. At first glance, it looked like a disagreement between a customer and a Lego resale business, the type of dispute that rarely attracts national attention. But over time, the controversy grew into something much larger. Questions emerged about ownership. Questions emerged about responsibility. And eventually, questions emerged about whether a popular YouTube creator had gone too far in his pursuit of answers. That creator was Ben Schneider, better known online as Reckless Ben. For years, Reckless Ben built an audience by placing himself in unusual situations, conducting unconventional investigations, and documenting conflicts that most people would never experience firsthand. His content often focused on controversial organizations, hidden communities, and stories that he believed deserved public attention. Supporters viewed him as someone willing to challenge powerful interests. Critics viewed him as a provocateur who frequently pushed boundaries for entertainment. But few could have predicted that a dispute involving Lego sets would eventually place him at the center of a criminal case. The controversy traces back to Oregon. According to public accounts of the dispute, a collector named Brian Manell and his father had spent years building an extensive collection of Star Wars Lego sets and rare minifigures. The collection reportedly contained hundreds of sets and was allegedly worth more than $200,000. In late 2023, the collection was allegedly placed with a Lego resale business, operating under the Bricks and Minifigs franchise system. According to the claims made by Brian, the arrangement was based on consignment. The expectation was that the sets would be sold over time, with proceeds split according to the agreement. For a period, everything appeared to function normally. Sales reportedly occurred, payments were reportedly made, and there appeared to be little reason to suspect that the arrangement would eventually become the center of a major controversy. But then the ownership situation surrounding the store changed. According to statements referenced in public reporting, the franchise location underwent a transition involving different operators. Competing accounts later emerged regarding how that transition occurred and who was responsible for decisions surrounding the business. What happened next became the foundation for years of accusations, disputes, and legal conflict. When Brian allegedly sought information regarding the remaining collection, he claimed that a substantial portion of the inventory could not be accounted for. Others involved in the dispute disputed those claims. The disagreement quickly expanded beyond a simple business conflict. Now there were questions about records, questions about inventory, questions about responsibility, and questions about where the Lego sets actually went. As the dispute continued, frustration reportedly grew on all sides. Attempts to obtain answers produced more disagreement. The parties involved appeared to have fundamentally different interpretations of what had happened. Some believed valuable property had effectively vanished. Others maintained that the allegations were inaccurate. The dispute might have remained relatively obscure, but then it attracted the attention of someone with hundreds of thousands of subscribers. And that is where the story took a dramatic turn. When Reckless Ben became aware of the controversy, he began investigating the claims and documenting his efforts for YouTube. What started as an online investigation would eventually lead to confrontations, police interactions, allegations of harassment, multiple arrests, public statements from law enforcement, and an intense battle for public opinion. At the center of everything was a simple question. Was a YouTuber exposing wrongdoing? Or was he crossing legal boundaries while trying to create content? The answer would depend on which version of events people chose to believe. And as more details emerged, the situation became far more complicated than anyone expected. As Reckless Ben dug deeper into the dispute, his investigation began moving beyond online research and phone calls. Instead of simply reporting on the allegations from a distance, he decided to become directly involved. According to Ben's public videos, he believed that something significant had happened to the collection, and that the people seeking answers were not getting them. He presented the situation as a fight for accountability, portraying himself as someone determined to uncover what he believed others were trying to hide. The investigation soon became content. Every conversation, every lead, and every confrontation became part of a larger narrative unfolding across YouTube. For viewers, it looked like the beginning of a real-life mystery. For the people on the receiving end of the investigation, it may have looked very different. By early 2026, Ben's efforts reportedly led him to Salem, Oregon, where the dispute had originally taken shape. His objective seemed straightforward. He wanted answers. He wanted to know what happened to the collection, and he wanted someone to take responsibility. But obtaining those answers proved more difficult than expected. According to Ben's account, attempts to communicate with individuals connected to the dispute led to a series of dead ends. One side directed him somewhere else. The next side directed him back. Questions were met with more questions, and every attempt to find clarity seemed to produce even more confusion. To viewers watching online, the situation began to resemble a bureaucratic maze. The more Ben pushed, the more resistance he appeared to encounter. At least, that was the version presented through his videos. The frustration became increasingly visible. Instead of moving closer to a resolution, the investigation appeared to be spiraling into conflict. What started as a search for information was becoming personal. And that shift would prove important, because once emotions entered the equation, the stakes changed. The focus was no longer just on missing Lego sets. Now the story involved accusations, reputations, public pressure, and competing narratives. As the investigation expanded, Ben began traveling between locations connected to the dispute. One of those locations was Utah, where Bricks and Minifig's corporate operations were based. According to Ben's videos, he hoped that speaking directly with people connected to the company would finally provide answers. Instead, the encounters reportedly generated more controversy. The interactions became increasingly confrontational. Law enforcement was contacted on multiple occasions. What might have been viewed as persistence by supporters was viewed very differently by critics. The divide between those perspectives continued growing. Every new video attracted viewers eager to see what would happen next. Some believed Ben was exposing important information. Others believed he was escalating a situation that should have remained within legal and civil channels. Neither side appeared willing to back down. As the conflict intensified, a pattern began emerging. Police involvement, trespass warnings, additional confrontations, repeated attempts to contact individuals connected to the dispute. Each new development pushed the story further away from the original business disagreement. The focus was slowly shifting. The missing collection remained the catalyst, but now another question was beginning to dominate the conversation. How far was too far? That question became increasingly important as events moved to American Fork, Utah. According to public statements later released by law enforcement, officers would eventually respond to multiple calls connected to activities involving Ben and his associates. Many of those incidents became major points of disagreement. Ben would later present them one way, police would later describe them another way, and that conflict over the facts became one of the defining features of the entire case. One incident that attracted significant attention involved what police later described as a staged delivery. According to statements attributed to law enforcement, a package was delivered to a residence under unusual circumstances. Police claimed the situation appeared designed to facilitate contact and filming. The details quickly became a source of controversy. Supporters of Ben argued that creative tactics were sometimes necessary when traditional methods failed. Critics argued that the incident demonstrated a willingness to cross boundaries. Regardless of which interpretation people accepted, one thing was becoming increasingly clear. The investigation was no longer proceeding through ordinary channels. It had become a spectacle. Every encounter was potentially content. Every disagreement was potentially an episode. Every confrontation could become part of a larger narrative shared with hundreds of thousands of viewers. That reality changed the dynamics for everyone involved. Actions that might otherwise have gone unnoticed now attracted intense scrutiny. Statements were analyzed, videos were dissected. Public opinion formed long before courts or investigators could reach conclusions. And while the online audience debated what was really happening, law enforcement officers continued responding to calls connected to the dispute. Each response added another layer to the growing controversy. Then came allegations involving repeated visits to private residences. According to police accounts, individuals associated with Ben appeared at locations connected to people involved in the dispute. According to Ben and his supporters, many of these actions were connected to efforts to pursue legal remedies and continue the investigation. According to police, however, the conduct raised concerns that extended beyond ordinary investigative activity. The disagreement was no longer just between business parties. Now it involved law enforcement. And once that happened, the potential consequences increased dramatically. What had started as a YouTube investigation was beginning to resemble a criminal case. Yet, despite the growing risks, the situation continued escalating. More interactions occurred. More complaints were filed. More attention followed. And with each passing day, the possibility of legal action became more real. But even then, few people expected what would happen next. Because according to authorities, the evidence they were gathering was beginning to point towards something much more serious than a simple dispute over Lego sets. And that development would eventually lead to the first arrest. As the investigation expanded into Utah, the situation took a decisive turn. According to public statements attributed to law enforcement, officers had already been responding to a growing number of complaints involving repeated visits to private properties connected to individuals tied to the Lego dispute. These incidents, viewed individually, were described as isolated interactions, but when examined together, they formed a pattern that authorities said raised concerns. Repeated contact attempts, multiple calls for service, and allegations of coordinated activity involving several individuals. At this stage, the investigation was no longer just about missing property. It had become about conduct, and that shift set the stage for the first major escalation. According to police accounts referenced in public reporting, officers responded to an incident involving a traffic stop connected to individuals associated with Ben Schneider. During that encounter, officers reportedly initiated contact after observing what they described as a traffic violation. Ben was present in the vehicle with an associate. What began as a routine stop reportedly developed into a broader inquiry into ongoing activity connected to the dispute. According to law enforcement statements, officers were already aware of prior incidents involving individuals linked to the case, including alleged attempts to contact or approach individuals at private residences. During the stop, officers reportedly questioned the individuals involved and assessed whether their actions were connected to the broader pattern of reported complaints. At this stage, no single incident defined the situation. Instead, authorities were evaluating cumulative behavior, multiple interactions across multiple locations, multiple complaints from multiple parties, and repeated allegations that certain actions were continuing despite warnings or trespass notices. Following this sequence of events, law enforcement escalated their response. According to police accounts, Ben Schneider was taken into custody in connection with allegations tied to stalking-related behavior and repeated contact involving private residences. The arrest marked a turning point in the case, because up until this moment, the situation had existed primarily in the space between online content and real-world disputes. But once an arrest occurred, the matter shifted into formal criminal proceedings. Ben's response, as presented in his own public videos, painted a very different picture. He claimed the investigation was being mischaracterized. He argued that his actions were part of a legitimate effort to pursue information about the Lego dispute. He suggested that law enforcement misunderstood the nature of his investigation, and he framed the arrest as part of a broader conflict between himself and authorities rather than a response to unlawful conduct. Supporters of Ben echoed aspects of this interpretation online. They argued that independent investigators often face resistance when challenging established systems or corporate structures. Critics, however, pointed to the same events described by police and questioned whether the actions crossed legal boundaries, regardless of intent. The disagreement over interpretation quickly became one of the central tensions in the case. What one side described as investigative journalism, the other side described as repeated unwanted contact, and neither narrative fully resolved the underlying factual disputes. Following the initial arrest, the situation did not stabilize. Instead, it continued escalating. According to police statements, further incidents occurred involving individuals connected to Ben's broader network of associates. These incidents included additional visits to residences and renewed contact attempts that law enforcement said were consistent with prior patterns of behavior. Each new development increased scrutiny. Each complaint added pressure, and each response from authorities brought the case closer to a more serious legal phase. At this point, officers began focusing not only on individual incidents, but on the structure of the overall activity. They examined who was involved. They examined how communications were coordinated, and they examined whether actions were being directed or encouraged by a central figure. According to police accounts, this broader investigation eventually led them to seek further legal authority, including warrants connected to the ongoing inquiry. The focus was no longer limited to isolated behavior. It now included the possibility of coordinated conduct across multiple events. And that is where the case took another major turn. Because shortly after the initial arrest and continued investigation, law enforcement executed a search connected to an Airbnb property where Ben and associates were reportedly staying. According to public reporting, the search warrant was tied to the broader investigation into the Lego dispute and associated allegations. Authorities reportedly sought evidence related to the case, including items that were believed to be connected to the dispute. The execution of that search warrant marked a significant escalation, because it demonstrated that the investigation had moved beyond street-level encounters and into formal evidence collection within a residential setting. And although no conclusive public outcome was immediately established from that search alone, the implications were substantial. It signaled that law enforcement believed the case warranted deeper scrutiny. Meanwhile, Ben's public narrative continued to develop in parallel. He maintained that he was being unfairly targeted. He continued to assert that his intentions were focused on uncovering wrongdoing in the Lego dispute, and he characterized the escalating legal situation as part of a broader misunderstanding of his investigative methods. But as additional reports from law enforcement were released, the gap between the two narratives only widened. One side described investigative persistence, the other described repeated boundary violations. And somewhere between those two interpretations, the case continued moving forward, with legal consequences no longer theoretical but actively unfolding.